Hello, good morning, everyone. As Konstantin said, we start with a tradition. We want to describe the market environment that we all operate in. And I think it's actually more important than ever, because we're in a market where stories of bankruptcy and hyper-growth both collide. We're in an environment that is extremely dynamic, structured by regulation, technological innovation, by digital moving into all other media, digital becoming an unnecessary prefix in a way. So although digital advertising has become fairly mature, as we'll see in those figures, the industry itself continues to be in flux. So we do need a compass to navigate this industry. And while there's an abundance of figures out there, I think it's very easy to just Google some statistics on digital advertising markets. Finding reliable data to really base business decisions on is incredibly hard. So it's exactly for this reason that more than a decade ago, we started this study. We started AdEx with the objective to bring together all the national IABs, their data and their expertise, to form a unified view of what's going on in Europe. Because people think of statistics in different ways. For some, facts are just statistics, and for others, statistics are facts. And we really want to be on the sides of statistics as facts to provide a robust and definitive guide to what's going on in Europe. So without further ado, let me introduce you to the study and take you through the numbers. First, I want to thank all the IABs for contributing. We had 28 countries submitting data, and as always happens in Europe, there are as many methods of collecting and measuring digital advertising as there are countries. So our job was really to harmonize and aggregate this and make this data comparable. And this is important, in particular today, where digital media budgets are increasingly planned on a pan-regional scale. So we need to establish Europe as a joint economic zone, not necessarily within political boundaries, but just in geographic and economic boundaries. So we took data from national IABs. We also relied on expert estimates. And increasingly, there are companies that, for one reason or another, cannot report or contribute to data. So we changed the method in a way where we went out and went into corporate filings, SEC filings from the US, company reports all over Europe to fill the gaps to provide a completely unified picture. We have a new country this year. We had 27 countries last year, and we have the Ukraine joining us this year. So we have a 28 market study, and we're covering about 96% of all digital advertising that's going on in Europe. The question is, of course, how do we define digital advertising? I just said digital has become quite an elusive term. We are focusing here really on, as much as we can, on kind of internet native advertising. So we're not yet including digital out of home. We're not yet including the move of video into addressable TV. That will all come in next waves. But this is really just basically digital advertising from internet native kind of as a launch pad into the digital world. Today, we operate in a market, 2018, of 55.1 billion euros. That's a 13.9% growth year on year, and actually an acceleration of growth compared to the previous year. What is 55 billion? That's roughly the GDP of Lebanon. That's roughly the size of Facebook overall. Facebook's revenues in 2018 were $55.8 billion, so around about 50 million euros. So this is the market size that we today operate in. And what's remarkable is really how this growth has come to be over the last couple of years. So when we did the first study, we were just in a 6.6 billion euro market, like for like, compared to all countries that we have in this study combined. And we now have a massive over 48 billion euro net addition over the last couple of years. What is remarkable is that there has never been a year of decline in digital advertising, despite very weak economic environments we had in 2008, 2009, and then the double-dip recession that came in 2012. Digital advertising in Europe, on an aggregate basis, has always paced on and has always continued to grow. This is also remarkable because we are now in an economic environment of high volatility. Brexit is looming. We see consumer expenditure, actually, growth in consumer expenditure declined over the last couple of years. So it's a tough environment to operate in, macroeconomically. Nevertheless, digital advertising continued to grow. And we can see it did so in a media market overall, in a paid advertising market that didn't grow very much the last couple of years. We can clearly see from kind of 2010 onwards how digital was kind of mainly entering a redistribution game, shifting budgets away from traditional media into a kind of a broad digital category. The market didn't grow much overall, but we saw an inflection point in latter years where digital contributed to new net growth into the market. Digital now is 45% of all ad investments in Europe, and that's round about the same as globally. It's globally around 42%, and it's more than in the US, which stands at 37%. It's interesting to understand where this growth comes from. I said it's mainly redistribution in paid media. We see many established brands establishing zero-based budgeting, so there's actually flat growth. It can only be redistributed. But digital is growing mainly from new advertisers, from former direct mail advertisers, from small companies, not the big Fortune 500, but other ones who are fueling new money and new growth into the overall digital economy. We can see here how this growth happened over time, and we can clearly see that for a number of years, this has been the fastest growth year in a while, which is remarkable because when I looked at the H1 figures in July, August, the picture wasn't that rosy. Remember, we had the threat of GDPR looming, and many markets were reporting flat growth or just growth in line with inflation. Advertisers were incredibly cautious in May, in June, in July. So we were expecting a market that wouldn't grow to more than about 51 billion. But it grew much stronger, so we saw a massive acceleration of growth in H2, and we can, at least on an aggregate picture, not really identify an impact of GDPR on the overall growth of the digital ad market. But let's dive more deeply into the individual markets and see how these 28 markets actually performed in comparison. We have so many markets, and the charts get smaller by the time you go to the smaller ones. So I focus on the top 10 here. There's not much change in the ranking of the top 10 over the last couple of years. We just saw Norway, Sweden, Spain growing above average, and Switzerland losing a rank, but the big markets remained the same. And you can see the stark difference between the markets. If you look at the UK, for instance, it's around 2.5 the size of Germany, which is partly also how local markets define and measure digital advertising. While we try to harmonize the studies, let's say the UK is a bit more liberal in its definition of digital than, for instance, Germany. The top three markets have around 55% of the total digital ad market in Europe, and the growth that was generated by the UK is roughly the same size as the Netherlands overall. If we go deeper, we can see there's a massive long tail of other markets, which in aggregate contribute a sizable amount to the overall economy. And you can see that if you look at the dots here, you can see that growth and market maturity do not necessarily correlate. Even big markets, and I'll show you in a second, very mature markets, grow quite strongly. And we can see this here very clearly, how the market distribution looks like. And in a way, it's quite fortuitous that we are in Poland today as our host nation, because Poland grew exactly in line with the European average. It couldn't be more perfect. Now, I always like this chart because it conveys so much information at the same time. You have the maturity of the ad market on the x-axis, which is the ad spend per capita, and then you have the growth on the left, on the y-axis. And you can see this is a look back at last year, how markets were positioned, and the size of the bubble is the size of the market. You would clearly see a market split in three. You saw a low maturity, high growth bucket. You saw a middle bucket that was not very mature, not very much growing, and you saw a small group of markets to the right here just pacing ahead. This looks quite different in 2018, where there are many more individual growth stories that make it more difficult to cluster markets in this way. But I've tried it anyways. So here we see the European average lines, and we can see where markets fall. And again, we have one segment of high growth, not very mature markets where there's significant potential, and just because they are not very mature, just because the economies are growing, these markets should grow in digital. We see another segment of markets that are underperforming and that are not very mature. Interestingly, this isn't just split by East and West, as some might assume, but we see some Western European markets in here as well, mainly based, it is on the strength of television in those markets. Then we have another section of above average growth of mainly Western European markets. We see some markets with structural challenges in digital, usually markets with a strong TV economy. And then we have the Nordics forming one cluster, and we have Switzerland as a strange outlier in a way, and the UK pacing ahead with very different dynamics to the rest of Europe. If we move into the formats, we can see quite different trends as well. I said the overall growth was 13.9%, but display advertising, so the category that interests most of us here in this room, actually grew the strongest. Display is banner, rich media, video, and so forth. It grew by 17.5%. We saw different dynamic in classifieds, growing below the European average, and also for the first time in quite a while, search was growing below the European average. So we got around a 3.5 billion new spend coming into the digital display economy in Europe. And we can see with this growth that digital display is closing the gap to search, which remains the biggest format, but only by a small margin. In particular, as digital display becomes more performance-driven, more budgets actually move away from search into display. At the same time, we see a new influx of brand spend also coming into display, so it grows from both sides. Some IABs stopped reporting data on mobile because mobile is now so ubiquitous that for some it doesn't make sense really to break it out. But for other markets, the mobile transition is still very much ongoing, so I think it's important to show these numbers. So we can clearly see that mobile now is about half of all digital spend in Europe, and the situation is quite similar between display and search. A bit stronger in display, largely due to the social platforms, a bit lower in search, mainly not because of the search volume, but because prices for mobile search are still a bit lower than for desktop search. When we look at the growth of the overall display market as an aggregate category, again, we see very different trends, and we see only 8 markets growing above the European average, and it's an odd mix of hyper-growth, not very mature markets like the Ukraine leading the pack, but also some quite mature markets, in particular if you look at France, if you look at UK, which are growing strongly above the European average. Classifieds and directories, very briefly. A strange trend, if you will. Some markets growing very strongly, others just above inflation a little bit. The key thing here is that we see a massive consolidation of classifieds in Europe. Axel Springer, Schibsted, and other companies moving in, providing scale and aggregation, which helps to drive the market at the same time where these companies are and where we see this lack of scale. Classifieds is eroding. At the same time, budgets are moving away from classifieds into performance-based display. So very different trends at play here. Search, very briefly, we can also see strong double-digit growth in most markets, some outliers, but broadly remains strong, remains reliable. In particular, in a volatile economic environment, search spend can be managed quite closely. It can be turned on, turned off like a tab. So it's fairly resilient to economic uncertainty. I think what's important is to dive deeper into display, in particular to look at the rise of video. So we can see video actually contributes massively to the growth of display, increasing its share. And it's quite telling that I think at this year's Interact, we are at the venue with the biggest screen, and I think that's a sign of where video is going to go. We again have a fairly narrow definition of video. We look at in-stream and out-stream. We do not yet include addressable TV. And video with that, if we look at it, it's around an 8 billion euro market defined in this way. So it's OTT video mainly, in-stream, out-stream, as I said. If we looked at the overall TV market or the total video opportunity, the market in Europe would stand at around 20 billion. And more we see both publishers and ad tech players, kind of reversing the logic of digitization, which we can already see a bit in these figures, where in a first wave, we had video coming into digital. And now increasingly, we're seeing video in digital buying principles and so forth, moving into other media. So mobile maybe was the first innovation, and now we're seeing actually the fastest growth in connected devices in the living room. And in the future, this video growth will mainly come from the living room as well. The structure, though, of video in our study doesn't yet tell that story. It tells something quite different. We had a strong reliance on in-stream video just a couple of years ago, but outstream currently is exploding, growing much faster than in-stream. Outstream here also includes in-feed video. Video now is a substantial component of display, making up about 1/3 of display in total, and even more so, more than that in some markets. Growth it's incredibly strong. It's double-digit in most markets, going above 50% in 2 markets, actually. And if we look at this as well, we can see a very strong clustering of video growth at around the 30% mark, so strong consistency in video growth in Europe. For the first time in this study, as we're trawling through SEC filings and company reports, we try to break out this, social in a more granular and robust way than before. And we actually have a 3-year historical, and we can clearly see, if we look at the display category, how the dominance of social is growing, kind of making up half of the total display market today. And growth dynamics are quite telling. So the vast majority of growth in display is actually coming from social. If you factor out social, the market is growing as fast as radio advertising in some markets, as fast as out of home in some markets. So if we split the market out, we have a 55.1 billion euro market. We have search, we have classifieds, we have a display total. But the bit that interests probably 90% of people in this room is actually not the 55.1 billion figure, but it's this figure. It's the 11.7 billion figure in which much of the open market programmatic operates, for instance, in which much of the non-platform video today operates. The growth of social, the growth of video are all not surprising stories. But the key question is, can we find something in the figures that point at something different? Constantine mentioned the rise of audio, for instance, or addressable TV, which addressable isn't part of the study yet, but something remarkable has happened. Despite the growing dominance of social, we actually see an acceleration of digital advertising in formats that are not video, that are not social, that are not mobile. So there are in Europe, there are pockets of growth. There are other areas in digital advertising that start to grow faster than this holy trinity of social, mobile, and video. And that shows that the industry continues to innovate. We have pockets of audio in here. We have a kind of more interesting programmatic service layer emerging, which also helps to fuel growth outside of platforms, outside of mobile, and outside of video. And it's these pockets of growth that will also be the focus of the next iterations of AdEx. So I hope that next year I can share some more detail on the dynamics behind this growth with you. Thank you very much, and enjoy Warsaw.